Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. I'm joined here in this special members webinar with my colleague Ian Bond. Ian, you've just come back from Georgia, which a country which experienced a Russian invasion 13 years ago. So you may have, that may color some of what you're going to say. We've only got about an hour's time, and we've got a lot of very eminent people watching this seminar who I'm sure will want to ask questions. So I'm not going to say very little. I'm going to introduce Ian in just a second, but just to say, I hope that we can sort out at least 3 questions before we in the course of the webinar. One is what are Russia's intentions? What does Vladimir Putin really want to do? Secondly, what is the best way of deterring him from invading Ukraine? And thirdly, if Russia does go for some sort of invasion or incursion into Ukraine, how should the West respond, and how united is the West likely to be in response? I should say this event is going to be on the record, and we will post it on our website later. But Ian, give us 10 minutes or so to set the scene. Tell us what you think. What's your perspective? And then we'll go straight to Q&A. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, well, great. Thanks very much, Charles. Yeah, I mean, those of you who know me will know that I am a natural pessimist, and this is a crisis in which it's easy to be pessimistic. And the discussions that I've had over the last few days really do lead me to think that we are on the brink of war in Ukraine. So what I'm going to try and do is talk a bit about Putin's worldview, and especially his beliefs about Ukraine, because I think those are influencing what's going on. I'll say a bit about the military situation, although I suspect there are people online who could say much more about that than I can. And finally, a bit about Western responses. So, I mean, let's start with Putin. I haven't met him, so like most people, I have to make deductions based on what he says or writes and what he's done through his time as president. It strikes me that although he wasn't particularly senior in the KGB, in some ways he seems to be the archetypal KGB man. There is a strong belief that people are out to get Russia. Now, I don't think that the West has ever really been out to get Russia, but despite efforts over the last 20 years to show that, Putin, I think, remains unconvinced. I think the other thing, and whether this is his KGB training or his Soviet experience or whatever, he doesn't believe in the agency of populations, the idea that people might come together of their own free will and overthrow a government. So it's been a constant theme in his discourse over many years that it's the West that organizes revolutions in the former Soviet Union. And that distorts his view of contemporary Ukraine. I think he's quite sincere in his belief that it is ruled by a junta installed by the CIA rather than by a democratically elected president and parliament. And that belief then interacts unhelpfully with his other belief, which is that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Now, Charles, you of course heard him say this firsthand at Valdai. In fact, I think you asked the question to which he responded that Russians and Ukrainians were one people at the Valdai conference in 2013. But over the last few years, he's really developed that so that he's now suggesting not merely that Russians and Ukrainians are one people in 2 countries, but suggesting that Ukraine itself is an artificial anti-Russian construct. And that's really one of the themes of the long essay that he published in July on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. And I think at this stage, with the forces that he has arrayed around Ukraine, there is a high and probably an increasing chance that he plans to do something about the unity of Russians and Ukrainians and to seek total or partial control of Ukraine. Now, I think even at this stage, he'd probably prefer to do that without military action. And what I mean by that is that in 2014, although quite a lot of what he did was achieved through the use of irregular and regular Russian forces, he was also able, in the Normandy format and in the 2 Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, to instrumentalize France and Germany to get them to put a lot of pressure on then President Poroshenko to accept the Minsk agreements, which, had he implemented them, and indeed had Zelensky subsequently implemented them, would have given Russia a dominant voice via its proxies in the Donbass in Ukrainian foreign policy and indeed Ukrainian domestic policy. Now, I suspect that Putin is counting on Macron and Scholz to repeat this exercise with Zelensky and to extract further concessions and effectively to turn Ukraine into a protectorate. We've got a meeting of officials in the Normandy format, i.e. France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine today, and I think it'll be worth watching what comes out of that. Now, I would expect that the effort to get Zelensky effectively to surrender without a shot being fired will probably fail. Zelensky knows that it would be political suicide to accept the kind of Russian demands that have been made. And that makes it more likely that there will be a military attack. There are Russian forces now on most of Ukraine's borders, except obviously for the western one, as well as in Crimea. And forces are being moved from Siberia to Belarus. These forces are numerically superior. They'd have complete air superiority. They could use electronic warfare to make it hard for Ukrainian units to communicate with each other. Russia will certainly enjoy naval superiority, so it could block any deliveries of military aid to Ukraine by sea, and that's really the only way of bringing in very large quantities of aid. Air deliveries of the kind that have been going on from the UK and the US and others can really only bring in relatively small quantities of military equipment at a time. And I would expect to see any military activity backed up with cyber attacks, disinformation, sabotage within Ukraine, and so on. I don't know the extent of Putin's territorial ambitions, but where he has his forces, he would be able to do a variety of things. He could attack Kiev from the north and east. He could take more territory in the east of Ukraine, for example, creating a land bridge to Crimea, because resupplying Crimea, including with water, has been quite problematic over the last few years. Or he could go back to a project that he had in 2014 and take all the territory in eastern and southern Ukraine that used to be part of the Russian imperial province of Novorossiya. If I had to bet, I would expect him to head straight for Kiev, because like Crimea, it has enormous religious and cultural significance in Putin's version of Russian history. And he might expect the Russian population to view its liberation from so-called fascists with more enthusiasm than the seizure of a few more square kilometers of the Donbass. Plus, a decapitation strategy aimed at the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev would leave Ukrainian forces elsewhere leaderless and easier to suppress. Now, there's a Western assumption that casualties would be a big problem for Putin and that therefore he wouldn't launch an all-out attack. I'm not sure that that's right. In past conflicts, in Chechnya and elsewhere, you had Russian NGOs and independent journalists who exposed the true casualty figures and the suffering of Russian troops and so on. Those organizations have pretty much been dismantled, banned. Journalists have been exiled or jailed or indeed killed. Even in 2014, the families of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine generally didn't make a fuss, either because the FSB came to knock on the door and intimidate them, or because they genuinely thought that it was their patriotic duty not to make a fuss. Now, the other thing that's assumed in the West is that Putin will face considerable resistance from Ukrainian forces. And indeed, Boris Johnson referred yesterday, I think, to this being a new Chechnya. Now, it's certainly the case that Ukrainian forces are a lot better now than they were in 2014, 2015, and the US, UK, and others are rushing weapons to them. But Ukraine doesn't have much of an air force or many air defense systems. Ukrainian forces would be very exposed. And the quality of military staff as opposed to frontline troops is questionable, according to some experts in Ukraine itself. Ukraine is developing territorial defense forces, but I don't think they yet have the kind of structures that, say, Finland has for mobilizing a large part of the population, all of whom know what their wartime function would be. So at the very least, I think we would face a protracted period when Ukraine was trying to get its irregular forces together after any conventional defeat. The political situation in Ukraine is also still a mess. Zelensky is playing down the Russian threat at the moment, maybe just because he doesn't want to create panic, but it may also be that he isn't giving enough impetus to the necessary military and civilian preparations for a conflict. And he's also chosen this moment of all moments to pick a completely pointless fight with his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, who has been charged with treason. Now, I'm not pretending that Poroshenko was an angel. He was certainly quite corrupt. He turned up in the Panama Papers, but there's no evidence that he conspired with the Russians. This looks like a purely political court case. In a similar way, Zelensky has gone after the Ukrainian oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, certainly not a good man, clearly with some criminal past. But Akhmetov has at least stuck with Ukraine. He hasn't sided with Russia like some of the other oligarchs in Ukraine. And pursuing Poroshenko and Akhmetov now, when Ukrainian society needs to be united, seems to me to be quite foolish. Right, a bit about the Western response to the crisis. Over the last few days, I've heard repeatedly how united the West is. Well, up to a point. It's clearly not the whole truth. The UK has been a lot more active in support of Ukraine than most European countries, but it's also quite distracted by Boris Johnson's party problem, by the Foreign Secretary being on manoeuvres, if I can put it that way, in an on-the-record webinar. I think the Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, is doing a good job on Ukraine. He published an excellent article debunking some of Putin's bizarre historical claims about Ukraine. But it's not clear what the UK's strategy is, or whether it's prepared to hit Russian money in London as part of a Western sanctions package. And I understand that the US is putting some effort into getting the UK and the EU to work more closely together on sanctions, and I hope that that bears fruit. Now, not surprisingly, European countries like Finland, Sweden, and the Baltic states have also been engaged in this crisis and supplying weapons and advice and so on. France is sending some military aid to Ukraine, but at the same time, Macron is trying to exploit the crisis to promote European strategic autonomy. Again, and this is an important topic, but this is really not the time for this. The German government, I'm afraid, I think it's moving in the right direction, but it's still a bit of a mess. We had the defense minister saying that Nord Stream 2 and the situation in Ukraine should be kept separate. Then Scholz and Foreign Minister Baerbock both indicated that if Russia attacked Ukraine, sanctions against Nord Stream 2 would be on the table. It's good. Then the government had to get rid of the chief of the Navy, who made some weird comments about Russia as a partner to oppose China, and about how Germany and Russia, were both Christian countries. Pretty awful. The decision to block the supply to Ukraine of old GDR weapons currently owned by Estonia is not a good one. And Germany still seems to have a problem acknowledging that Ukraine doesn't merely have the right to defend itself against Russia, but it has the right to ask others for help, and that help should be given. Overall, I don't think that Putin will have heard anything from the West that makes him feel that the costs of attacking Ukraine will be greater than the potential gains from, as he sees it, reuniting the Russian and Ukrainian people, whatever the Ukrainian people may think about that. And he may feel that he only has to threaten to turn off the flow of Russian gas to Europe to get the West to back off from any sort of resistance. If I were a European politician at this point, I would put a very high priority on securing alternative supplies of LNG, whatever the short-term costs would be. I think Russia probably can't turn off the gas for long, but in February or March, when the weather in Europe is cold, it probably wouldn't have to. In terms of sanctions, which Charles mentioned, the problem is that the Europeans keep taking things off the table. So it seems as though cutting Russia off from SWIFT is off the table. We'll have to wait and see whether the Americans are prepared to impose some of the sanctions that have been discussed in the US Congress, and which I think the administration is rather reluctant to undertake because of the effects that they might have on European economies. But I think we have to be realistic. The kind of sanctions that might make Putin sit up and take notice might have a devastating effect on the Russian economy, but they would certainly have quite serious effects on Western economies as well. I think I'll leave it there. I'm quite happy to discuss Putin's 2 draft treaties in the Q&A, but my short view is they're basically red herrings, and they're working in that Western leaders are treating them as though they were intended seriously. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ian. The way to ask a question, the best way for me is to put your hand up. Then I can immediately see who wants to ask a question. If that doesn't work, then you can send a message on the chat function, but it's a little bit easier if you do it with hands up. So do that as a first priority if possible. I see Bobo Low and Steve Erling already putting their hands up. I don't know if Jan Tekar would like to put his hand up at some point, because Jan is a senior thinker from Germany who might like to respond to what Ian said about the German point of view. Let me just start off with one question of my own, then I'll go to Bobo Low. You, like many people in think tanks and governments, Ian, in Britain and North America, are quite pessimistic. You seem to think that war is more likely than not. I guess let me just be a devil's advocate and present the other case, the more optimistic case. I mean, you said yourself, Ian, that if Russia suffers serious casualties in Ukraine in fighting there, because the NGOs that used to publicize such casualties have been suppressed, Russian people might not know about it. But surely, as the Afghan conflict itself shows, if a lot of Russians get killed, people do know about it eventually. There's no way the government in Russia can just cover up the fact that serious numbers of Russians are being killed, if that is the case. So surely there is a political risk to Putin of getting bogged down in a quagmire in Ukraine. And as for the economic sanctions, which I guess you've said, perhaps rightly, don't seem to be that stringent from what we hear so far, even not very stringent economic sanctions would surely be a bit of a problem for Putin. The existing sanctions have had some effect on Russia. For other reasons, the Russian economy has not done very well in the last decade or so. The standard of living has not grown. The economy has failed to diversify away from natural resource exports towards more modern industries. Surely Russia has very long-term, deep-rooted economic problems, which a very bad relationship with the West will exacerbate. The Russian stock market's gone down a lot in the last few days. So surely the biggest threat to Putin's regime in the long run is probably the economic stagnation and possibly decline. So my point is, Putin's not stupid, whatever he is, and maybe he sees there is a real downside to invading Ukraine, or however much his heart and his emotions may want to unite the 3 countries of the Ruski Mir in one country.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those are good points. I mean, on the quagmire question, this turns to some extent on what Putin thinks Ukrainians would do and what he would be able to do in response. I mean, I suspect that he genuinely does believe that a significant part of the population will welcome Russian intervention. Again, I go back to the essay. He I think believes in his heart of hearts what he told you, that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. And therefore, if they're one people, of course, they're not going to organize the kind of insurgency that the Soviet Union faced in Afghanistan. And I think there's also a timescale issue, which is, if you can defeat Ukraine very quickly and install a more compliant regime, then the chances of an insurgency developing are much smaller. It's really only if you do get bogged down that there's a problem. On the economy too, yes, it's got long-term problems, but in the short term, he's got a war chest of $620 billion in his reserve funds. Gazprom can afford to have no revenues for a while, and Putin can afford to bail it out, and the Treasury can, as it were, raid those reserve funds for a while. And Putin's experience in the past is that, yes, he's seen that the West has kept the sanctions on since 2014, but it hasn't really gone big. It has actually increased its dependency on Russian oil and gas since 2014. So the long-term problems are certainly there, but he may think that if he can navigate the short term and achieve a decisive outcome, then business will go back to business as usual in due course.
Thank you, Ian. I can see we've got 6 hands up, so let's perhaps take the questions at 2 at a time so we can get through a few more of them. Let's start off with Bobo Lowe, then Mary Jeffsky. Bobo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, certainly can, Bobo.
Great. Great presentation, Ian, and I agree with your basic conclusions. I think there's sometimes a tendency to see Putin as responding to his own insecurities, whereas actually I believe that he feels really good about his chances and also about the weakness of the West. But I wanted to ask you push you a little bit more on how you think the actual conflict might play out. You say that Putin most likely will go for Kiev. Does that imply a kind of almost a total war approach, so a multi-front approach, ending up with the surrounding of Kiev? And what are your thoughts about timing? Do you think Putin would wait until the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, i.e. February the 20th? And also, how long do you think the conflict might go for if Putin does indeed decide to go for Kiev?
Thanks, Bobo. You're asking me a lot of questions that I think I don't have any very good answers to. I mean, the reason that I think, I have no insight into this, but the reason that I thought Kiev looks like the most promising target to me is Putin is now really moving quite substantial forces into Belarus. And, that gives him the shortest route to Kiev. So he's got substantial forces on the sort of northeast border, not far from Kharkiv, and that's another axis. But he's doing what looks like more than just diversionary forces in southern Belarus, and so that's that to me makes me think Kiev would be the most attractive prize. It has the most significance. Kharkiv, okay, you could do what I think was done in sort of 1918 and have a kind of alternative Ukrainian government set up in Kharkiv, but I mean that's not a great population attracting gesture. Timing, yeah, I mean I've heard quite a few suggestions that the Chinese didn't appreciate it, that in 2008 the Beijing Olympics was partially overshadowed by the war in Georgia. So yeah, maybe timing will be dictated by the Winter Olympics. Maybe it will be dictated by when all the forces are in place. I mean, as far as one can tell, there are still forces moving west from Siberia. So it may just be that the General Staff doesn't feel yet that it has the degree of superiority that it wants to have for an offensive.
Okay. Mary Jeffsky. Do speak, Mary. I'm afraid we can't hear you, Mary.
I'm trying again.
That's better. We can hear you now.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
I find it actually very hard to agree with most of what Ian's report says. And one of the reasons is that, in fact, this whole scare about an imminent Russian invasion, all of it has really been driven by the West, by statements and meetings from the US, from the UK, and from various other places. We've got denials, consistent denials from Russia that any invasion is on the cards. Kiev, as Ian said, has remained extraordinarily calm if they really think that there's a realistic threat from Russia. So, I mean, my question is really, why has this Western scare campaign been unleashed right now? What's behind it? Because if it weren't there, it seems to me there would actually be no crisis about Ukraine.
Ian.
Well, thanks, Mary. I mean, I think I don't accept the premise, really. I mean, 100,000 troops are there. There's no question about whether they're there or not. So it's not a scare. It's a reality. Now, you know, there may be questions about what they're going to do. Equally, you know, it's the Russians, not the West, which is saying, you know, you must accede to our demands or else. We don't know what the or else is. But you know, there is that Chekhov phrase, isn't there, about if there's a gun on the wall in Act 1, you may be certain it'll be fired by the end of the play. And so, you know, I don't think Putin has moved 100,000 troops and an enormous amount of military equipment to the borders of Ukraine just because it's nice there at this time of year.
Let's turn now to Lord Hannay. David, over to you.
Am I unmuted yet?
Yes.
I'm unmuted now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, Ian, thank you for that splendid overview. Nobody could possibly suggest that you weren't a pessimist after listening to it. But I do think you do rather overdo the pessimism. But two questions. Firstly, China. There's just a brief reference in one of the questions to that, but surely there are real discordances between a full-blooded Russian invasion of either more of the Donbass or taking Kiev, and pretty well every aspect of Chinese principles over foreign policy. How much stress do you think this would put on the relationship with China? And secondly, do you seriously doubt that if Putin went for and captured Kiev, we would immediately be in a full-blooded Cold War situation, which would make most of the shifting of feet and so on, and the discomfort about saying what you would do if pretty academic, frankly. And it would surely push the whole of Europe into a Cold War situation with pretty damaging consequences for a Russia which has many more links to the outside world than it did during the Cold War, and it didn't go terribly well for them then.
Yeah, I think those are both fair points, and obviously I don't know what passes between Russia and China on these issues, and I don't know to what extent the Chinese would be prepared to accept Putin's argument that Ukraine is an artificial construct. I mean, you know, if I were Putin, I would probably be putting quite a bit of effort into persuading Xi Jinping that, you know, rather in the way that that Taiwan is a sort of artificial construct that is really part of China, so Ukraine is an artificial construct that is really part of Russia. And, you know, no doubt Xi Jinping has been presented with a Chinese translation of Putin's essay to help with the effort. Whether the Chinese would buy that, I don't know. They haven't really bought the Crimea annexation, but nor have they really made a fuss about it. They, you know, they've kept quiet, sat on the fence. It hasn't really damaged the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. Do I doubt that we'd been a full-blooded Cold War? I mean, the trouble is that those links that you talk about go in both directions. And it's certainly the case that a complete breach of relations would do serious damage to the Russian economy. But it's equally the case that it would do quite serious damage to Western economies. And the question is, are European leaders all prepared for that extent of damage? And I'm not sure that they are yet. Some are. I mean, you're right. I do think that the Swedes, the Balts and others would be pretty hard line on this because of their geographical location. But I'm not sure that some of the others would. There isn't. I mean, if you look at opinion polling in Germany, and again, I don't know whether Jan is online, but if one looks at opinion polling in Germany, it's not terribly encouraging about German willingness to stand up for principles or even for NATO allies.
Okay, I've got 4 or 5 people still wanting to ask questions, which is great. They're all men. If some of the ladies in the audience would like to speak up, we'd welcome a female voice. I turn now to Steve Erlanger from the New York Times. Steve.
Thank you both. Ian, there are lots of points of view, God knows. So I just want to ask your view of why Putin is trying this now. I mean, he could have done it under Trump. Trump wouldn't have cared very much. Did he sense some weakness in Biden? Does he just feel old? What's your sense of why he's willing to roll the dice like this now? Thank you.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's an excellent question. I think he does sense weakness in Biden, and I think he sees a certain amount of political churn in Europe that may help him. Germany's got a new government, still finding its feet. French are about to have elections. The UK not in the greatest political shape. We're all emerging from a pandemic, which has damaged our economies, taken up a lot of time and bandwidth. But yeah, I mean, I think he probably does see Biden as being quite a weak transitional figure. And he probably, I mean, I'm not sure who it was, but somebody said, Ukraine may not be in NATO, but NATO is in Ukraine. Putin, from his perspective, can see more NATO allies helping Ukraine over the last couple of years. NATO trust funds, NATO Ukraine meetings, NATO is a enhanced opportunity partner, and so on. So he may think, well, this is a good moment. I'm in a good position to strike, and the West is in a weak position to respond.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Turn now to James Spencer from AIG. James.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you now.
Marvelous. Thank you very much for that. I would share your pessimism. These are more points than questions. The Chechnya analogy. Chechnya is incredibly mountainous. And the terrain therefore favors the defender, particularly if the attacker is in armor. Ukraine is not. Ukraine is flat. And so Russia, which is heavily armored, will be able to advance very rapidly against a fairly lightly armored Ukrainian defense. Related to that, Ukraine currently, I think I'm right in saying, is the 4th largest supplier of food to Europe. And that would be potentially a large geopolitical point of leverage, particularly as climate change happens. And we are looking at 20 years' time, Russia with its hydrocarbons being less important. There are lots of countries which are trying to work out where they can get political leverage. So I would certainly regard that potentially as one that Putin is looking for in the long term, as well as his his sort of legacy bit of reuniting little bits of Russia that has been lost. And finally, this is a question. The Dnieper runs pretty much straight through Ukraine. Would that not be the logical area through which to advance? It's got most of the Russian speakers, not too many of the Ukrainians, and it's a good geographical boundary that he can put his feet on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. I think your comment about Chechnya is very astute, and I think that is a big difference between Chechnya and also Afghanistan, for that matter, and eastern Ukraine. The point about Ukraine as a food supplier, that is interesting. I had not realized that Ukraine was such a major part of the European food supply now. I mean, it is certainly a big agricultural producer. So that is indeed quite an interesting point. I mean, on the Dnieper, yes, I mean, it is in a sense a natural border. But if you stop at it, then you've only got the sort of boring bits of Kiev, not the more historically and religiously significant parts. So I mean, it's certainly a possibility, but and I guess if you're sitting on the east bank of the Dnieper, you pretty much are able to ensure that not much happens on the west bank that you don't have control of. So yeah, it's definitely, I mean, it would be a very defensible new border to impose.
Okay, thank you for those, Ian. So we've got 7 people left to want to ask questions. I think 7 or 8 actually. I think we can squeeze everybody in if the questions are brief and the answers are fairly brief.
Okay.
If anybody wants to ask a question, hasn't asked one yet, hasn't put the hand up yet, now is the last chance before I close the list. So let's turn now to Robert Cooper, formerly of Foreign Office and the External Action Service. Robert.
I wanted to, trying to unmute.
Yes.
I wanted to ask at the beginning, I think Ian said that SWIFT seemed to be off the table. Somebody said that, have they? But I was then going to say after that, if Putin does, if the tanks do actually roll, then it won't matter what people have said. I assume that everything will be back on the table, at least in theory. So, I mean, so that's my question, but I wanted to make a comment as well, and that is, it would be really useful if there's somebody here who could do it, for somebody to write a proper account of what the Minsk agreements say, because I once spent some time trying to understand the Minsk agreements, and I found them almost 100% unintelligible.
Yeah, Robert, thank you very much. Yes, I mean, various people have suggested, including I think Peter Altmaier, but I may be wrong about that, that SWIFT is off the table, and there have been the various off-the-record comments to the effect that SWIFT is off the table because the side effects of it are so complicated and damaging for European economies as well. What I think might still be on the table is the Americans denying correspondent banking facilities to major Russian banks, which would have a more targeted effect on the Russian economy. Will everything be back on the table if there is in fact an attack? I mean, quite possibly. The problem at the moment is that what we really need is clarity on a willingness to do enough that that it's a deterrent before there is any attack. And the problem is that every time somebody in the West says, well, we're not going to do that, then that encourages a miscalculation on the other side, that actually, well, the costs will be manageable. And on the Minsk agreements, you're quite right. And I mean, this has been one of the problems. The biggest problem is the sequencing question. The Russians say you have to read these agreements sequentially, and that in particular, that means that Ukraine has to give autonomy to the occupied regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and allow them to hold local elections essentially without Ukrainian supervision, so returning whoever Russia wants to have returned. And only then would Russia give up control of the Ukrainian-Russian border in those areas. The Ukrainians say, you don't read it sequentially, and we need control of our territory in order to organize these kinds of elections. So yeah, there's a problem with the Minsk agreements. And of course, both sides will exploit those ambiguities to support their own case.
Yeah, and I'm going to take questions in groups of three now, as we had a last minute flurry of questions. I think we can fit everybody in if we take groups of three, and if Ian could just keep his answers fairly short.
Okay.
So starting off with Timothy Garton-Ash from Oxford University. Could you, Tim, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Quick comment on Germany and two questions. You're absolutely right about German public opinion, but there is an absolutely fierce debate in what the Germans call die veröffentlichte Meinung, published opinion, with major figures like Wolfgang Ischinger being witheringly critical of the German government. So I think that's worth noting. Two questions. First of all, do you think there is any diplomatic concession or offer that the West could conceivably make, which Putin could declare a victory on sufficiently to persuade Russian opinion? And the other side of that, what, if any, diplomatic concessions or offers do you think Berlin or Paris, if not Washington, are prepared to make?
Right, let's go to the next. Okay, Corrie says that Timothy Garton-Ash has just asked her question, so we'll take Corrie off the list. And the next person on the list is Luigi Scazzieri from the CER. Luigi.
Sure, thank you, Charles. So my question is simply to what extent Russia is influenced by its experience in Georgia, which again was trying to get closer to NATO, similar to what Ukraine is doing, but in that instance, a relatively limited war seems to have secured Russia's position, but yet you say that kind of a full-on attack is more likely. So I wonder if Moscow is unhappy with the way things have played out there. Thank you.
Okay, finally in this round, let's turn to Olga Ivshina from the BBC. Olga.
Thank you, Ian. My question is short. Do you think, so you said Mr. Putin is ready to withstand the casualties. Is he ready for the Western response if they decide to take on his cronies and effectively block their accounts and basically turn their connections with the West?
Okay. Ian, if you could deal with those three lots of questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay, I'll try and deal with those briefly. Diplomatic concessions to Putin. I mean, I think in a sense, we could call Putin's bluff by looking at some of the draft treaties that were presented before Christmas. But I suspect that it's pretty difficult, actually, short of compromising Ukraine's sovereignty, to offer Putin something that he would regard as being an effective guarantee. I mean, he's talked about legal guarantees, but he's also said, but you can never trust the West. They say one thing and then they do another. So it's hard to see how even a legally binding guarantee would ultimately end his belief that that the West is out to get him via Ukraine. And on what diplomatic offers would Berlin and Paris be prepared to make? I mean, that we might know a bit more about that this afternoon, although I doubt it. But I suspect that they might be more willing to put pressure on Zelensky, for example, to announce that Ukraine was now going to be a neutral country. After all, that's something which Yanukovych had already proclaimed when he was president. He'd stopped pursuing NATO membership altogether. So I wouldn't rule out that they would say, well, Yanukovych was willing to concede that. Why wouldn't you? Luigi, the Russian experience in Georgia. I mean, I think this goes back to the Ukraine not in NATO, but NATO in Ukraine. I think Putin probably feels the same way about Georgia. the UK and others will be sending forces to exercise in Georgia later this year. Lots of ships visits. HMS Defender was there last year. From Putin's point of view, he has not made Georgia the buffer state free from NATO influence that he probably hoped he would. And I suspect that therefore, he thinks he's got to do something rather more dramatic in Ukraine to achieve the desired effect. And Olga, I think we should be going after Putin's money in the West and Putin's cronies in the West. Whether at this stage that's enough to be a deterrent when you've already got your 100,000 troops on the border, I'm becoming increasingly doubtful. I think that's the kind of thing that we should have done a while ago. It should have been part of earlier rounds of sanctions. And in the short term, I suspect Putin would tell these people, take one for the team and I will compensate you later. In a slightly different context, rather as in the Sochi Olympics, lots of oligarchs were forced to pay for the Sochi Olympics, but quite a few of them subsequently got very lucrative state contracts to make them right again.
Okay, now I'm going to take two groups of two questions. Then I'm going to take one final question from Rod Line, the former ambassador to Moscow by himself. So let's start off with the first group of two is Hugo Dixon, then Sebastian Contreras. Hugo, over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Charles. I had a question about how this might be viewed in China, and in particular, if Russia invades and the West does not do what David Haney suggests, and we do not immediately enter into a sort of Cold War situation with Russia, but have sort of slightly disorganized minor slap on the wrist type of sanctions, because we're not willing to take the pain. What message will this give to Beijing, and particularly coming only 6 months after the chaotic pullout of Kabul?
Thank you, Hugo. Now turn to Sebastian, I believe from Vodafone.
Thank you. My question is regarding one of these theories that is being thrown out regarding the possibility of the Russians wanted to build a land bridge with Crimea. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so Hugo, there's been various variations on the theme of will China act against Taiwan, either while the West is distracted by the crisis in Ukraine, or because of a belief in Western weakness, and I think that's a legitimate concern. Now, the US is responding to that by sending a couple of aircraft carriers, as I believe, to the South China Sea. So I think the US is clearly alert to the risk that China will misinterpret. But equally, we're seeing a lot of Chinese air incursions and other rather threatening maneuvers. So I think it is quite a dangerous time in the Far East as well as in Southeastern Europe. And Sebastian, the point of the land bridge, at the moment, Crimea can be resupplied by sea, or it can be resupplied by the bridge across the Kerch Strait, but that's quite a fragile piece of engineering. Crimea's water supply comes from Ukraine, and the Ukrainians pretty much cut that off some years ago. So there's been a real problem of water shortages in Crimea. So from a purely practical perspective, there's been a belief for some time that the Russians would like to establish a land bridge from the bits of the Donbass that they already occupy to the north of Crimea, to enable them to supply it more easily and to make it more defensible in a sense.
Okay, thank you. So now some of our questioners seem to have disappeared. So we've only got two left on the list. There is time for another one or possibly two. If somebody wants to put in a late question, please do so. So next I turn to John Loff.
Thank you, Charles. Ian, I wanted to ask you about your assertion that the draft treaties are simply a red herring. I'm not sure I personally share that view. It seems to me this crisis is, in fact, about much more than just Ukraine. And that Putin's ambitions are genuinely to try to reformat European security arrangements. He understands perfectly well that several NATO member states would rather walk back that language or those commitments that were made to both Georgia and Ukraine in 2008. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible, and perhaps I'm being too dismissive of the treaties. I mean, when I read them, I thought, this is pretty extraordinary stuff. And it's not as though there's been any kind of pre-preparation of the ground, but maybe this is a maximalist opening bid in the hope that at the very least NATO would commit not to expand any further. So yeah, I mean, I can't entirely rule that out. It's just, I'm not sure that these two drafts really pass the smell test somehow. They just look a bit too designed to produce a rejection.
Okay. Three final questions now. As Katja Glod seems to have taken her hand down, so I assume she doesn't want to ask one. I now turn to Anatol Koletsky, then Ioannis Tickets, then Roderick Line.
Thank you very much, Charles. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Following on from the last point, might not Putin be quite satisfied, or partially at least satisfied, by a statement, a public statement from the West of what is acknowledged privately to be the reality, and that is that Ukraine will not join NATO and cannot conceivably join NATO, at least, let's say, for the next decade or 15 years, and in any case would not be able to join NATO as long as Ukraine is engaged in a border dispute with Russia. Now, if that were publicly stated, and we all know that actually to be the case, might not that be quite an attractive proposition for Putin? Because then he would, get that guarantee. Perhaps he could also ask for a lifting of sanctions, of many of the sanctions that were introduced in 2014, in exchange for not invading Ukraine, which perhaps he doesn't really want to do. I mean, isn't that quite an attractive deal, potentially, that could be done from Russia's point of view, and also maybe an acceptable one for the West at a time when nobody wants to see the oil price go up by another 50%, and potentially causing, a crisis like the 1973 Arab oil embargo.
Ian.
Okay, sorry. I thought you
Yes.
you were taking them in groups, so we're back.
No more groups. It's just
okay, fine.
Two more questions after this.
I mean, I don't think that Putin is going to be satisfied with that sort of statement, because frankly, we have in effect made those sorts of statements for quite a long time. It is well known that every time there is a NATO meeting, there is a great struggle before NATO agrees to refer to the 2008 communique language that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. So, if all Putin wants is reassurance that they're not going to join anytime soon, he's pretty much got that anyway. I mean, I think there is a reason that the Russians are talking about legally binding guarantees in their draft treaties. But as I say, I'm skeptical, given that Putin, essentially doesn't think the West can be trusted anyway, that he is going to accept legally binding guarantees unless they're backed up by something else, whatever that might turn out to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. The penultimate question from Ioannis Turkidis from Cyprus.
Thank you again. All right, my question is a bit the big picture in terms of what Putin is saying, that Russia's imperatives are buffer states. Take into account, number one, weak economics for Russia and the vast territory. The argument that they're making is that buffer states are part of the security. How do you interpret this claim, and what kind of credibility do we assign to it? And we take it further down the road, long term, it creates an explosive situation of clash between Russia and the West. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I have a real problem with the notion of buffer states, partly, on purely, as it were, ethical grounds, because I do believe in the sovereign equality of states, and the idea of buffer states presupposes some sort of limited sovereignty for them, but also because the history of buffer states is not a particularly happy one. Belgium's neutrality didn't prevent it being invaded during the First World War, and the kind of cordon sanitaire between Germany and Russia that was formed at the end of the First World War didn't stop those states being absorbed by Germany and the Soviet Union, or both, during the Second World War. So, I just don't see the concept of buffer states as being particularly helpful in modern political circumstances.
Okay, finally, now I turn to Roderick Line. Thanks for your patience, Roderick. You were ambassador to Moscow a while ago, but I'm sure you still follow it very closely. Tell us what you think, Roderick. Can you unmute yourself, Rod?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are.
First, China. I know this is really Bobo's territory, but I mean, China is a problem for Russia. The Belt and Road Initiative is encircling Russia to a degree. The Chinese are pursuing relationships in Eastern Europe through the 17+1 process. They're investing in Belarus, even in Ukraine. But if Russia goes for policies which widen the chasm with the West, it means that Russia will be even more dependent on China than it has been since 2014. And that's a very, very uncomfortable position for Russia, as any Russian strategist will acknowledge privately, but they won't say a word about that in public. Secondly, on Ian's likely projections, I agree with Ian that a bloodless victory would certainly be the preferred option, but he seems to dismiss the possibility that the Russians, rather than going for broke straight off, will try progressively to up the ante by incrementally increasing pressure. They've talked about using military technical means. This might explain why they keep saying that they're not actually planning to invade. It might mean not invade straight away, but incrementally try to break Western resolve by going up the scales through these different military technical options that they seem to think they have. Thirdly, on Ian's most likely scenario, which is going to Kiev and decapitating the present Ukrainian leadership, you ask, what then, if you're Mr. Putin? Has he actually done the maths? I mean, Ukraine is larger than France. You've got 42 million people, of whom one might estimate that 3/4 would be pretty resistant to being occupied. It was Ukrainian nationalism that ultimately, in December 1991, broke the Soviet Union. You have examples in Afghanistan and Iraq of large countries being occupied that didn't want to be occupied. And it would land Russia really with a massive nightmare for years and years to come. Mary questions in her comment whether Putin is under any illusions, and I think she's right, that the Russians would be welcomed as liberators. What does Ian think about that?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. I mean, the uncomfortable dependence on China I mean, you know, a few years ago, I thought this was bound to turn up sooner or later. I mean, it still hasn't in a way. And I thought if it was going to turn up recently, it was going to turn up in Kazakhstan, where, you know, there is clearly both of them have rather strong and at times competing interests, and even perhaps competing interest groups. And yet it seems to have been managed somehow relatively quietly. So I sort of like to believe in the fact that Russia and China are at some point going to split again. But at the moment, they seem to be able to find enough common ground to stop that happening. And we'll just have to wait and see how long that persists. On the incremental pressure, yeah, I was struck by the military technical means and wondered what exactly they had in mind. Was it merely positioning missiles and the like in threatening positions that would make us all think twice before we did anything to cross Russia, rather than actually using those missiles? But I come back to the fact that we've got 100,000 troops and a lot of kit sitting on the border. So what is to be done with them? Are they all just going to be redeployed back to their original locations? Are they? I mean, it's possible, I suppose, that these become their new permanent bases, that they sort of settle down and start building, and that we're then faced with forces which could at very short notice be deployed to Ukraine if Ukraine does something unwelcome to Russia. So yeah, I mean, that is possible. That is possible, that the aim is not to use them, but merely to keep them there so that they're a constant threat. And on the decapitation question and whether Putin's thought it through, I mean, I may be entirely wrong about going for Kiev, but I remain worried that Putin believes his own propaganda about the Ukrainian people. You know, one of the things that I am concerned about is there hasn't been much by way of insurgency in the occupied areas of the Donbass. And one of the reasons for that has been extreme brutality used against anybody who has shown any resistance. There's this so-called Izolyatsiya prison in Donetsk. And you know, there are extremely credible accounts of torture and extrajudicial killings and so on. And Putin may simply think a tiny number of people would resist, and the overwhelming majority of people would be glad to be back in the bosom of Mother Russia. Now, you know, everybody that I have spoken to who has had anything to do with Ukraine recently says that's totally wrong, and Ukrainians don't think they're Russian and will resist. But I can't rule out that Putin, who you know, wrote 7,000 words justifying his belief that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, actually believes it.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Rod for that final comment, and to Ian for answering so many questions. And thanks to everybody for taking part. I'm sure most of us hope, in fact, we all hope, that Ian's pessimism turns out not to be true. I certainly hope it's not true, but it may be. None of us know. And indeed, I suspect that it's possible that Mr. Putin himself may not actually know what he's going to do. Politicians do tend to leave difficult decisions to the last minute, don't they? Not only in Russia.
I should be delighted if my pessimism is wrong.
I'm sure you will be. Thanks very much to everybody. This was an on-the-record event, and it will be posted on our website very soon. Thanks everybody for taking part. Cheerio.